Search and seizure, the right against double jeopardy, so you can't be charged for the same offense more than once, the right to an impartial jury, the right to confront witnesses against you, the right to call supporting witnesses, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, the prohibition against ex post facto laws, the right to be free from excessive fines and excessive bail, and the right to be clear of a notice of the criminal charges, so you can't be tried for something different than what you're charged for. And then, of course, the three that we got, the right against self-incrimination, the right to legal counsel, and the right to a speedy and public trial. So those are all of the constitutional protections for the criminal defendant. So now let's flip that, and let's talk about the constitutional rights for crime victims. Go ahead. Let's identify those. Yes?
Is that like Title IX or things like that, or?
That's not in the Constitution. Yeah.
There isn't really any way, I mean, it's just kind of for the criminally accused.
There's none.
Yeah.
There's absolutely none. There's no constitutional rights for crime victims. Absolutely none. And I think that's pretty awful. Because if you truly think about it, every single person is either a crime victim or knows a crime victim. And so that's pretty devastating. But it becomes pretty evident pretty quickly when a lot of people become involved in the criminal justice system, how heavily it can be weighed. And so, okay, so it's not all that bad. There are rights that crime victims do have. So if they're not in the Constitution, where are they? United States Constitution. They're not in the United States Constitution. Where are they? Yes.
Maybe state laws?
Okay, the state constitutions maybe, okay, that's partially right, okay. As of today, there are 36 states that have victims' rights in their state constitutions, okay, so that means that 14 states do not have victims' rights in their state constitutions, and the 14 states that do not have victims' rights in their state constitutions: Hawaii, Minnesota, Iowa, Arkansas, Georgia, Wyoming, West Virginia, Kentucky, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. Yay. So, where do our victims have rights? Yeah. Anybody? Yeah?
They have rights in like the media.
We'll get to that. Hold that thought. Hold that thought for me, okay? We'll get there. Our victims have a Bill of Rights, okay? Pennsylvania has the Crime Victims Bill of Rights. So essentially what that means, they're covered in statute, okay? Which certainly is not as strong as a constitutional right, because if their rights are violated, that means they have no recourse. Okay, if your constitutional rights are violated, there's recourse available for you, certainly as a defendant and as a crime victim in those areas, those states that do have it. It's also not fair. I mean, if you are a criminal defendant, your rights are the same no matter where you are. California, Florida, Arkansas. As a crime victim, it matters where you are a crime victim as to what your rights are going to be. It's different wherever you go, and that's not fair, depending upon what your rights are. And a lot of people don't realize that until it happens to them, to what their rights are going to be, and they don't realize what they are or what they aren't. And so I do have a copy here of the Pennsylvania Victims' Bill of Rights.
Thank you.
And I'm not going to read them to you, but I would just like to kind of go over some of those very quickly, just because I think some of them are real important. there at the top, to receive basic information on services available, that would be us. To be notified of significant criminal justice actions and proceedings. And again, some of these seem pretty like, yeah, of course. But before this was enacted, the victims were not being notified, okay, because it's the Commonwealth versus the defendant. And if you are not a witness or are being called, there's no reason to tell you anything. And this was previously, before this was enacted. And so this is now in place, and so that would never happen again, that the victims aren't notified. We do have staff in both courthouses, and so we do take on a role of notifying crime victims of this. To be accompanied, that's us again as well too. To submit prior comment on the potential reduction or dismissal of a charge or change in a plea, that's really important because that gives victims a voice. You may see sometimes that people are charged with a whole many different types of charges, and then they're kind of brought down, or there's a plea bargain brought into place. So what that right says is district attorney's office has to meet with the crime victim when that happens, before that happens, and pretty much explain that to them. And so they sit down with them and say, we're going to reduce this charge and this is why, or we're going to accept this plea bargain and this is why. And the crime victim can have a voice there. They can submit prior comments and say, I don't agree with that. That's not. But what it doesn't say is that the district attorney has to agree with it. It just gives them the voice, and they can have a voice. But it does provide them. Somebody has to sit down with them and explain to them why it's happening. And our advocates are typically there at that time as well too. And so that's good. Things don't happen without their knowledge. The next one is real important, to have prior comment on a sentencing decision, including the submission of a victim impact statement. Victim impact statements are extremely powerful. If you sat through an entire trial, you had no voice, if you were a family member of a homicide victim, and you had to sit through their whole trial, and now the individual's been found guilty, you actually now get to have your say. You can stand up in front of the defendant, in front of the judge, and say, this is how this crime has impacted me, this is how my life has changed, and this is what I think should happen to this person, and this is why. And so it gives you that opportunity. Public speaking isn't for everyone, and some people freeze. They can submit it in writing, but it can be very powerful too, if individuals have that opportunity to have a voice. Some of these other ones here, going down a little bit, to give prior comment on and receive notice of post-sentencing release decisions. What that essentially says is once your individual there is incarcerated, whether it's in a state correctional facility or a local jail, they can pretty much do the same thing. State correctional facility. They can go in front of the parole board. So if the parole board's meeting, they can go in front of the parole board and pretty much make that same impact statement and say, I don't think this individual should get out of jail, and this is why, or I do. Whatever their thoughts are on that individual, if they're the crime victim of that person.
We've even had people Skype in to the parole
Yeah,
board.
from
right?
our
They-
office,
So
yeah.
maybe they can't get up there, they don't feel comfortable driving to wherever it is. We'll set up a place in our office where they can Skype or video conference in and still be able to give that impact statement.
The next three there, all of those notice of releases there, those are all part of a statewide program called SAVIN, Statewide Automated Victim Information Notification. And so what that pretty much says is that's, a state correctional facility or a local jail, anytime there's a change of status in your offender, if you've registered as a crime victim, it's easy to register, it's just a little postcard. But anytime there's a change of status, your offender gets moved to another facility, your offender escapes, makes bail, dies, gets transferred to a mental health facility, any change of status, you will receive a notice. You will receive a phone call 24 hours a day, every 15 minutes, until you put your PIN in. Got help you if you forget your pin. Because it doesn't stop, it just keeps ringing, and keeps doing that notice to you, because, in case of safety issues, in case the person has escaped or made bail, and it's, you know, particularly like a domestic violence situation, in case that person's out or something, so. Assistance in victims' compensation claims, as Emily said, we will help you with that. To be present at murder trials, and also to be present at executions as well, too. So if you're a crime victim and you wish to see the execution, of your, offender, you can do that. Anyone know when the last execution was in Pennsylvania? It was Gary Heidnik in 1999. So we do have a moratorium on executions right now, so, probably won't be any, during this governor's administration right now, so, yeah.
How long has this Bill of Rights been around?
You know, it's been amended in various times, but I'd say early nineties is when we first started talking about it. No, so, any other questions on that side? Yeah.
Cause she said that 88% of sexual assault happens by people you know.
Mhm.
And so how does that play out with these laws, like in reporting, and what happens to them after this, and like how do they go back to their jobs or their place, like, you know, after the crime has happened, if they report it,
Right.
what ends up happening? Because I remember reading something about that rape case in Harvard and how she took him to court and did everything, and then he made an appeal and was back in the semester next.
It's
I'll let
actually
you take that one, Emily.
that's who I was at Lehigh seeing last night, was Camila Willingham, actually from the hunting ground. Yeah, it's sexual violence is much different than any other type of crime in several ways. It's handled and looked at much differently than any other type of crime. It's one that's highly underreported, so a lot
It's
of
the
times.
most underreported crime.
Yeah, a lot of times somebody doesn't even come forward, or if they do, they're not pressing charges or anything like that. It's to a support service like ourselves. So yeah, how do they go about things? Still interacting with this person potentially, especially since we know they will probably know each other in some way. And there's no good answer for that, I'd say. There are measures that somebody can take, like a protection order, to keep separated, whether they've pressed charges or not, to keep that person at a distance and not interacting. Other times, unfortunately, people uproot themselves as a survivor to eliminate that interaction. Depending on the age of the person, if they're in school still, for example, there's measures that a school can take to keep people separated or at a distance. But there's, I'd say, no.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's family members too, and so, you know, that becomes really difficult. And it certainly is one of the reasons why people choose not to report, because of that either relationship or, you know, familiarity with the perpetrator, so.
It's also a reason that a lot of times survivors of sexual violence don't recognize what it is that occurred to them. Because, and a lot of what I do is sexual violence 101 conversations. Consent isn't something that, as a general population, we have a clear understanding of, and neither is sexual violence. So we think of it as the person wearing a ski mask, jumping out of the bushes in the dark alleyway, randomly attacking us, physically violent. And that happens. In no way am I saying that that doesn't happen. But more commonly with these cases of sexual violence, it's somebody that you know, somebody that you trust, that you're comfortable with, and it's a betrayal of that trust to gain power and control over that person. So a lot of times, if I have that hard set idea of this is what it looks like, this is the type of person that commits this, and my experience doesn't fit that mold, there's a disconnect there. And I'm no longer associating what I've experienced as that crime that I see in Law and Order SVU all the time, because no, that's way worse, that's something different, that's not what happened to me.
Another question on the Bill of Rights. So looking at the Crimes Victim Council, you guys have been around longer than the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Did you guys play any role in having this established?
I serve on the Coalition Against Rape Board of Directors. We have staff members who are on the board of, some of the other state coalitions, so we play a very active role, in, legislation as an organization, so,
And trying to
yeah.
advocate for stuff like this.
Yeah, we advocate a lot for this. I was certainly around when this was coming to fruition, so yeah, we are always looking for, input on legislation and things like that, so yes. So very quickly, if you flip that to the other side, we have media rights on there, and I just wanna take a moment to go over those. These are not included in the Victims' Bill of Rights, but I think they're important, just because, crime victims a lot of times are thrust into, the spotlight, particularly some high-profile cases, and this is their first interaction with the media. The people who they see on their TV every night are now, camped out on their front lawn, it can be really, intimidating. They can say no, and a lot of times they just don't know that. And so, some of these rights here, asking for a specific reporter, release a written statement, refrain from answering questions you don't think are, appropriate, demanding a retraction, ask that offensive photographs be omitted from airing and publication. That's a little difficult because once they're out there, they're out there. We just had an example, we were looking at some photos right after the Las Vegas shootings, and some articles, and we were